Good afternoon. My name is Mary Sabatino, and on behalf of all of us at Galerie Lelong Co, I would like to welcome you to the sixth conversation in our series, Galerie Lelong Dialogues. Today's conversation is titled Abstraction, Investigations of Social Change, and is held on the occasion of Tariku Shiferaw's solo exhibition, It's a Love Thing, It's a Joy Thing, his first solo exhibition with our gallery, on view through May 15th. We are pleased to welcome artist Adebunmi Gbadebo, fellow Lelong artist Samuel Levi Jones, Tariku, in a conversation moderated by the art critic Seph Rodney. All three artists belong to a generation of Black artists who are pushing the language of abstraction while retaining cultural specificity, a movement that Rodney identified in a 2017 essay for Hyperallergic. Coming of age in a period when the consciousness of racial violence has reached a national and unavoidable scale, all of the artists are addressing injustice and charging their abstractions with a message for social change. I am honored to introduce today's speakers, and if you'd like to learn more about them, please refer to our website where their biographies and full curriculum vitae is available. Adebunmi Gbadebo is a visual artist who creates sculptures, paintings, prints, and paper using human hair sourced from people of the African diaspora. Rejecting traditional art materials, Ada sees hair as a source and a means to center people and their histories central to the narratives in her work. Currently focused on the True Blue series, she investigates the complexities between land, erasure, and value in the American South. She is represented by Claire Oliver Gallery in New York. Samuel Levi Jones, another artist of our gallery, is inspired by questions of authority, representation, and recorded history. His ongoing practice centers on undoing physically objects associated with systems of power, control, and information. He often rearranges books into deconstructed grids that expose the flaws and question the command of knowledge. Jones was born in Marion, Indiana in 1978, and now lives and works between Chicago and Indianapolis, Indiana. His solo show, Rise Up, will open at Galerie Lelong Paris on May 20th, just a day after the lockdown opens. Tariku Shiferaw, a new artist to our gallery, and we're so excited to welcome you for your first solo show, has a practice of mark making that references the history of abstract painting and the hierarchical structures which are embedded in its scholarship. His ongoing series, One of These Black Boys, references musical genres that have originated in Black communities: hip hop, rhythm and blues, jazz, Afrobeats, and the blues, a context that charges the world with cultural history. Shiferaw was born in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in 1983. He grew up in Los Angeles and now lives in New York City. Dr. Seph Rodney was born in Jamaica and came of age in the Bronx, New York. He is the opinions editor for Hyperallergic and writes on visual art and related issues. He has also written for the New York Times, for CNN Op-Ed, American Craft Magazine, and NBC Universal. He can be heard weekly on the podcast, The American Age. His book, The Personalization of the Museum Visit, was published by Routledge Publishers in May 2019. In 2020, he won the Rabkin Award for Journalism. I'm going to hand the mic over to Seph, and I will join the conversation later for the Q&A, and we hope you'll have many questions for these wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Mary. And welcome to everyone who's in the audience, and welcome to Adebunmi, Sam, and Tariku. I think, I'm not sure what the order is, but basically we're gonna have you sort of introduce your practices to the audience. So is there, yes, Adebunmi, you're going first? Awesome, okay, take it away. You're muted, by the way.
technology. Okay, so hello. I like to start off with this painting because it was this painting being introduced in art history class is when I made that shift to abstraction and through material. I remember my professor introduced this painting as radical, and I was like, it has to be because of this Black figure, because that was the only thing drastically different from the hundreds of paintings we saw prior. But just to know historically, to know this painting, the the point of controversy is all centered around the white woman. And my professor went on to talk about the cat and the curtain in her shoes, with more vigor and detail than the other human being in the painting. And that moment showed me a couple of things. That one, representation did not inherently provide more meaning. It showed me that because this painting referenced Venus of Urbino, this another reclining nude from 200 years prior, that even if I were to root my work in this Black subjectivity, it would still be viewed or critiqued historically through this history of paint. Because paint is connected to, and paint is connected, it comes with this white Eurocentric history, no matter which way you slice it. So you could go to the next slide. So I made that shift, that I had to make not only the shift through representation, but the shift to in my material. And my first kind of predominant material was Black hair. The fact that it carries our DNA and our history. It literally had all that in the work. Years later, I started a True Blue series. So here's the image of that series, where I've been exploring my relationship to this country, which started on True Blue Plantation in South Carolina, Fort Mott. And I've been, I think through material, I saw that as a way where I could reference things. It could be it's embedded with these histories. So in that series, I use indigo, I use cotton, I use denim, I use archival images connected to True Blue. So like the wills of the enslavers, I found the names of some of the people who were enslaved on them, and them listed at $2,000 on that will. And all those things are kind of formed together to kind of create a new archive or a new telling about what True Blue used to be and what it is now. You could go to the next slide. And I'll finish on like the last sheet I did in that series. So it's about 7, well, the size is there, but where I've become even more interested in not just True Blue, but that process of indigo production. So on that sheet, I have kind of the steps in the system of the laborious process of producing indigo. And it was so laborious and even like violent that the life expectancy on an indigo plantation was 7 years. And not only that, but like I have printed on the surface notes from the enslavers as they listed the steps. So I think material has given me a lot of space to talk about all these things in a non-representational way, in a reductive way, like starting from representation and kind of reducing it down in these works.
So I guess I'm going next.
I think so. That sounds good, Sam. Yeah.
Can we go back to the other 2 slides? And the one before that one. So yeah, this is a recent piece that I just completed not too long ago, and it is a mixture of law book and medicine and medical books. worked with a number of different source materials, from encyclopedias to law books, medical books, even art books, and history books. This book particularly just sort of thinking about sort of where we are at this day and time. But in working with law books, initially I was working with law books as, I would typically make a piece with just the law books, or typically make, each specific or particular work with, that set of book, that grouping of books from each category, rather than sort of mixing them up. And I've been mixing them up a little bit. And with the law books, it was a response to police brutality. And, in working with medical books, I've sort of been thinking about kind of like a universal relationship that we have to I don't know, life and all of our bodies, and how we're much more sort of alike than different. And thinking about sort of the how the medical field in relationship to law and control of the body, if you will. Not just, and also really think about too, initially when I started working with the medical books, I was, looking at a lot of different things with, medicine in relationship to the Black body, whether it be the Tuskegee studies, different things like that. And then also thinking more about sort of the relationship of disparities as a whole. And I guess we can go ahead and go to the next one. I'm going to not take too much time. This right here is a recent work that's actually showing in Paris, and it is sort of a continuation of abstracting my process. And I've actually pulped the book covers to where they sort of become non-recognizable. And I'm sure, and through this conversation, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And let's go ahead and go to the next one. I just sort of wanted to kind of throw a curveball. This is what I've been calling it's my sort of secondary phone, and I call it my dumb phone. And I'm not going to give the brand of the phone, because I'm not going to give them a plug for that. But just thinking a lot about sort of this idea of slowing down, and sort of being detached from my device, the smartphone, if you will, as much as possible, and its relationship to sort of my way of being grounded as much as possible, rather than sort of having my face stuck in a screen and missing out on things. But I think there's a relationship to that in terms of the work, and sort of this idea of slowing one down and giving attention to the things, the details and the nuances that go on around us, that sort of kind of control us without our really being aware of those things. And I'm going to stop there.
Okay, Sam, I'm going to need that phone information right there. Okay, so this is a view of my current show at Galerie Lelong, but if we can start with Cranes in the Sky, Grace. So when I began this series, One of These Black Boys, in 2016, I remember I was sitting in the studio, just oftentimes contemplating on what it is that I wanted to do about the works that I was making at the time. And some of the most important questions that came to mind at that time is, knowing the history of abstraction, how do I place myself into it, knowing that even the history of mid-century art had not really included people that look like me, and especially in abstraction when you look at it. And so I started placing these horizontal lines against these painterly gestures, and conversations around paintings. Historically, there's always been talks about, hey, like, these painterly marks, painterly gestures, and everything else that, that has to do with the surface tension. And so I was interested in interrupting that
placing these horizontal marks in a way that was deleting it or marking it or placing something else against it. So there's like, it's only viewed in relation to the abstraction over it. And so I was interested in the idea of interrupting it, disrupting that surface, speaking, you know, of just painting in itself. And so, but from there, I went on to think about how I could also place myself. It was a way of marking the surface for me. So mark making was very important in my work, a way of marking oneself into society, but also oneself into art history. And so this was the way I wanted to enter. But prior to that, I'm thinking about like cave markings, cave paintings from 40,000, 30,000 years ago that we find today, how people have left their marks in society, in their own society. And for us to find 30, 40,000 years later and to say, hey, like this group of people existed. And so in a way, I was engaging this to say that, to also be a part of the conversation, right? And so, but this was not enough. The physical mark was not enough. So I started thinking about a different way of marking a surface, marking an ideology, a thought process. And that was through naming it, through titling the works. And so I began to title each work based on music by the African diaspora, from hip hop to R&B, jazz, blues, reggae, Afrobeats, and all these songs, even though they would have different contexts, different conversations about from love to breakups, to, you know, societal construct, to your neighborhood, to, you know, history. And like, for instance, when in King Kunta by Kendrick Lamar, he's talking about his personal life in the hood, but he's also referring to Alex Haley's book, a literary novel that also refers real history. And so there was this way of like overlaying history on top of these works by titling them using titles that come from like a different place than just art history or art. And if you may go to the first slide again. So this is an installation work that I have done for this particular show, and it's titled Jerusalem, Master KG, which is an Afrobeat track. I think a lot of people know it from the pandemic when they had all these dance-offs like on TikTok or Instagram. And so, but I was also interested in that title in ways of thinking about how Jerusalem or Jerusalem also represents many things in different cultures, like in three of the major religions in the world today, right? From Judaism to Christianity to Islam. And so, but you know, when this artist was talking about it, Jerusalem, I was like this place of peace, place of rest. And I thought it was very interesting. And it went along with this exhibition that I was putting on, and thinking about joy as a form of resistance, in a way of marking this little oasis of saying, I mean, you see this pink wall with objects that resemble shipping pallets that also refers to the systems that we exist in, like from, you know, capitalism, the way we move commerce around from, give me 30 seconds and I'll be done. And so the way we move commerce around the world, you know, from bodies historically to the way we move culture around and who benefits from it and what group. So in a way, this little oasis was a way of, you know, letting one's hair down and thinking about this joy and while everything else is around it. So and in that way, it was just, you know, interior, internal, and very resistant, right? And we'll stop there and we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the things that occurred to me initially when I had a conversation with all three of you, I walked the gallery with Tariku last week, and I was on the phone with Sam and with Adebunmi a couple of days ago, I thought of a piece that Sam shared with me, which is written by Leigh Rayford, the title of which is Burning All Illusion, Abstraction, Black Life, and the Unmaking of White Supremacy. She says in that piece, and in that piece she directly addresses Sam's work, she says, abstraction means a state of withdrawal from some original point. And that just a basic definition of abstraction. And you're nodding at Adebunmi. When I read this, I immediately thought of your work, because your work seems very much like you are withdrawing from an original point, which you kind of alluded to when you are not kind of, very much, you very clearly alluded to in introducing us to your work. And I thought about the same, I thought the same thing with Sam, that clearly, yeah, your work is about a kind of withdrawal from this original point of this notion, this enlightenment notion of you can get all the knowledge in the world from books, right? You're throwing that into question. But then Tariku, I'm not sure that that applies to you. It feels like you're not exactly about a state of withdrawal at all. You're talking about mark making to make people understand that you exist and that you are important, that people that look like you are crucial to this time and place. Am I reading that correctly? Would you say that's true about you? And about Sam and about Adebunmi?
I agree.
Okay. All right. Adebunmi, you look like you want to talk about that.
Yeah, like, and I always start like with Olympia because like just learning, like being a student and then learning, having to learn art history as a requirement, you really see how like paintings or works of art within that canon connect to the one before. So, you know, there are artists who are super successful in continuing that medium and pushing that medium and really rooting it in Blackness, like Kerry James Marshall, right? He's wildly successful for that. But like, I understand that there's a lot of articles and there's a lot of criticism, not criticism, like, but like in terms of critiques of his work historically, comparing it to other white masters. For me, like it is a withdrawal because it's like a complete rejection, and it kind of came like a strategy and a challenge for me as an artist. Can I root my work or uproot it from one history and really root it in something else that was totally connected to us?
And I just want to narrow the scope of this just a little bit, Adebunmi, by saying that I think what you're talking about is the history of portraiture or the history of representational painting, particularly with reference to Kerry James Marshall, kind of courtly painting, which is what I think his work, Olympia, is referring to. Yeah, the way you described it to me on the phone was you said that you felt the weight of that history and you really wanted to get representation out from, get yourself out from under that weight by just leaving representation aside and starting with something that is materially just unapologetically Black. You cannot deny the Blackness of Black hair, at least in the way that you place them in your work.
Yeah, correct. And because it's like, it literally has our DNA, like the very foundation of that material is our history.
Right, the spiral.
Yeah.
Yes, for sure. And Sam, with you, how do you imagine that withdrawal works out in your work?
I think there's a push and pull to, you know, being withdrawn and not being withdrawn. I think for me, you know, it's funny because, you know, I shared a photo of a new work with you when we were having a discussion, and you mentioned Clifford Steele. And I think early in my work, when having conversations, you know, sort of the audience or audience members would reference or mention other artists, particularly a white artist. And they would ask me, like, am I influenced by them and whatnot? And I don't pay or give any attention to, you know, any artist or say that I'm influenced by them, if you will. And not that I feel it's okay to sort of, you know, someone to see a relationship and maybe mention it, but I don't go into that. I sort of, I deviate from that because for me, you know, in the way that you're talking about material, for me, there's a direct relationship of the material, specific relationship of the material to what I'm talking about. And that's what is most important for me. And I try to sort of keep the conversation within that lane, because I don't know, it's a different conversation when you're talking about sort of like this alignment, if you will, with those of the past who are sort of notable and whatnot. Just, you know, a different conversation needs to be had.
So, you know, I'm going to say something that I know you know, but I'm going to be a little bit pedantic about it to bring in the audience, that this is the foundation of art history. Art history is founded on this notion of genealogies of practice, right? That you can sort of look at Cezanne and look at Matisse and then look at Picasso and then look at I don't know, the members of the Blue Rider group, and see a kind of progression of modernism, right? A kind of growing abstraction of the figure, of the human figure, and of narrative. The thing that strikes me about abstraction, and I will admit that I struggle with this sometimes, that I walk into a room and I really, in a given gallery, and I don't necessarily know what's going on. But one of the things that I think people who work in this genre will say is that it gives them a kind of freedom. And I want to talk about what kind of freedom you find, because I think I have some ideas of what kind of freedom you have, but I'd like to hear from you, and I think the audience would like to hear what kinds of freedom you get from working in this way.
For me particularly?
For everyone.
I think, you know, I don't know. The only other medium that I've sort of really worked in or spent a lot of time with even when I did, you know, worked with the lens, when I did photography, I sort of shied away from imaging a figure, if you will. And, you know, specifically, I was working with a group of migrant workers, and I had opportunities to image them, but I imaged sort of the context of their living spaces and the environment that they worked in. And I did that specifically because I didn't want to objectify them. And I tried to image those spaces in the way in which you could feel the presence of the body without being sort of very deliberate about it. I don't know. I sort of like this idea of maybe mystery and sort of, you know, figuring things out.
And also, I'm sorry, what?
I like the idea of like having a bit of mystery and sort of leaving an openness to sort of like figure things out rather than just sort of having it very present and obvious, maybe.
Right. So you're working by illusion, like as in ALLUSION. That you're pointing to something that's slightly off camera or off the picture frame.
Yeah.
Right. So Tariku, if I can ask you, what kind of freedom does working in the way you do, you think, affords you?
For me, it's really the endless possibilities in what you could do in abstraction. It's really it gives me the ability to talk about multiple things, layered, you know, subject matters. You know, I could talk about the body, but I could also talk about societal construct, but I could also talk about the things that I love, like about abstraction, about painting, about these painterly marks as well, you know. And there's this freedom for me to go in and out and weave in and out of like these places. And so abstraction for me is a very it's a place of thinking, but it's also a place of, you know, enjoyment, you know.
So when I was in the gallery with you last Saturday, and you walked me through your show, and you showed me the pieces that are kind of similar to the one that's behind you, but they had different, they were all warm tone. The horizontal bars were all warm tone, and they varied. And we talked about how for you, they were reminiscent of skin tones. where they went from sort of like a mahogany to a sort of bronze, and the way that you talked about it, I could tell that it was just a delight to you to be able to do that. Like this is what I was thinking when I thought of this question, was that you all get to have this kind of technical and material experimentation and exploration. Like it is really just that basic, that you can actually be in a room, create something and delight in it. And I think that's where the idea of your show comes from, this notion that it's a joy thing, it's a love thing, that interaction with materials can be a source of joy for you.
Right, just like jazz and blue artists who delight in the act of making that art, in the act of like laying all their interesting thoughts into this music, into this track. That moment is the joyful part. It's not the I think I've told you, I've mentioned this to you before, where it's not the moment where they get paid for performing, but it's the moment where they're expressing that.
Right.
But also to add on to your an answer to the question you had posed, another form of freedom is also like I said, to go in and out of like layered ideas, right? Where you saw those colors, colorful, horizontal bands going across the surface, not only skin tones, but also like these shipping palettes that I had seen in so many different like tones in the past, right? Like, whether they're weathered in the sun or in the rain, or they're brand new, or they've seen or in different colors or whatnot. So there's this interesting moment of reference to both.
I want to say something, because I walked through the show too, and Tariku, I don't remember if I want to show the image on my phone, but it was this piece here.
Oh, word.
When I take photos, I take details of them. But when I looked at that, that's what I immediately thought, skin tone. So even though the figure isn't there as we know it, I picked up on that immediately. And I don't know, I had a great appreciation. Sort of like that led me into, that bit of information led me into sort of looking at the other works in the same way. I was like, okay, and I looked at the bars as sort of skin tones from that one hint, if you will.
Right. It's also this it has this action of a redactive notion, right? Where it sort of marks that surface with a new idea, a new meaning, a way of blocking information or just being a part of that information. And so when I was using these black bands, then it's just like this FBI redactive like sort of gesture, right? But then again, when I'm using the skin tones, then they become bodies, right? And so they're read differently on where and how you see them.
And I want to just point out the sort of semi-obvious thing, which is we kind of represent this group speaking to each other right now, kind of is representative of what you've done with the different. I mean, look at us, like we are arranged, right?
Word.
Right? Like when you have Black people show up to the barbecue, like this is what you got.
I got a lot on me right now, a lot of light.
Yeah, for sure.
I think also though, when you do that, you create like your own language for yourself. Like Sam, you said it, like you looked at this painting and then that informed how you looked at everything else. Like Tariku, you've created like a map key. I hope that doesn't like sound like I'm like reducing what you've done, but like you're creating a language, a code within, kind of imbued within the work, which is really interesting.
Word.
Thank you for bringing that word into the conversation, because I was like, when you first said language, I was gonna slightly disagree with you, because I don't think it's quite a language, but code. I actually have written down here, this is my next question. Is there a code to your work? And I'd like you to start answering this, Adebunmi, by which the uninitiated viewer might come to understand it. And how do people get to know this code in your work?
Yeah. I think on one level, there's like I guess I think of code as like there's the insider and the outsider.
For
So
sure.
there's this
Mhm.
coded part. Like I remember specifically a mother who has like a son that she takes to a barber shop a lot. And I could immediately identify like, oh, this is here from a barber shop. So that became like kind of our insider as Black people, that we automatically understand what this here is. And then there's, I think, these other codes or things I play with that don't necessarily directly speak to this idea of like the insider and the outsider, but more how I've coded the work with information that relates to this history. So like the use of um, blue or denim specifically becomes kind of this point of reference of thinking about denim and its connection to the indigo trade. So I think I play with it like in a historical way, and then in this cultural way. I remember my earlier works when I would collect a lot of the barbershop here. I would get like razors in the donation bags, and I would keep the razors in the piece as a way of um, like I remember some Black people thought it was comical, like, oh, like I may cut myself, but then it was like a coded way of saying, like, to maybe a white audience, like this issue around um our hair being touched. And that was like my kind of passive aggressive way of like,
Mm,
you maybe, don't
mhm,
touch or you'll get cut,
mhm.
which is like extremely passive
Word.
aggressive. So I think like I play, but I don't think that's not maybe at the forefront. But I think I do kind of think about it in an indirect way.
Right. So if I'm just to break it down a little bit, what it sounds to me like you're saying is that there's a code, which is the code of shared experience of being in a barbershop, seeing hair on piled up on the floor, and then there's the historical codes, material codes that kind of indicate to a viewer that a particular object, i.e., something that is indigo dyed, has you're referencing that history
Correct.
of the creation, the production of this particular kind of material.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Um,
Seph,
Emma,
it's also interesting that
mhm,
how that has been done in history, right? Like in
mhm,
the history of art making or the way art is viewed,
mhm,
it's always been made for the higher class, and therefore, and most times, the higher class society would be all white, right? And for instance, when Greenberg would write about Cézanne's work, he would say, to the commoner, these fruits that Cézanne is painting is just these beautifully painted fruits. But to those that are, enlightened and those that know about the work, then it's about the color and the paint and these gestures in there. And so it's kind of interesting to think about code and how it's also been previously used, right?
Yeah.
well,
And
for, go ahead, Adebunmi, please.
no, I was gonna say like, and I think like just being Black, like code becomes a part of how we exist and survive. Like this idea of code switching as a survival mechanism, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think code is like so connected to who we are as people.
Precisely. Sam?
That was really interesting. And what she said is sort of about, the code switching. And, I think no matter what the case is, for the most part, people, I don't know, as at least for me as an individual, I want to fit in. And then there's sort of like this, like, in terms of like, I don't know, you may navigate various contexts and sort of what you want to fit in, you want to get along, if you will. And there's, a tension between how much you sort of maybe give up to fit in, how much you give up of yourself or lose yourself. And, it's a tricky thing. And I think even, gosh, I've been having conversations recently about sort of navigating the art world, and so how much do we sort of fit into this context that already exists versus creating a new context. And yeah, that's something to really contend with.
Yeah, sometimes we try to create that new context and boy, does it fall flat. Like this idea of post-black, like, oh, what were we? Oh, no, not when we weren't ready for that, and
Yeah.
we're not post-black yet.
I
For
want to
sure.
say, I want to add to that. I was just like, gosh, I'm gonna go out. I may be going on a limb, but I'm going to say it anyway because through the pandemic and through the last year,
Mm.
and maybe this may be a question, but in walking around in sort of different spaces and whatnot, like all the construction that's going on, and sort of like, and it was up in Harlem, and sort of like really sort of amazed to see that new building that's supposed to be built, Studio Museum, is not being erected yet. And my question, I beg the question is like, for all this interest in sort of, Black art, if you will, and whatnot, and sort of like that being the mainstay of sort of like the crux of what we're doing is like, why is that lagging?
I don't know. I think that might be worth actually getting at in the Q&A if you don't mind, Sam. I have just one more question. I know we're running out of time, and I know that we want to get the audience involved, but because we did wrestle with the idea of freedom and the idea of art historical lineages, or well, lineages is a fine word, that we inherit, and how you sort of dig yourself out from being forced to define yourself via those lineages. In that piece that I had written about that Mary referred to at the beginning of the hour, the piece for Hyperallergic, How to Embed a Shout, written in 2017, I went back to it and I recall that in speaking with Valerie Mercer, she said that one of the things that kind of defines this cohort of Black artists working now in abstraction is that they all want to be responsible for themselves and for each other. And that was key for her. And I want to say, like, if you are really responsible, you're being responsible for yourselves, for representing your people in some way, or representing some idea, a coded idea of what Blackness is. Doesn't that kind of inveigh against the idea of freedom? Because now you're responsible. Now you've got some work to do.
But it comes, I mean, I guess what you're saying is it comes back to the idea of community. And I don't think that's being bound and that's not taking freedom away, really. If you're in a community, then when one goes down, the other helps, And so if that is what it means to be responsible, then you will never fall,
Nicely put.
I think for me, I agree. Like it doesn't feel like it goes against feeling free. For me, it feels like it is grounding. And especially like in this True Blue series, where I'm dealing with this history and referencing people who are not here, who went through this traumatic experience, and their kind of existence has been erased. I feel responsibility in depicting that history accurately and truthfully in a way that gives honor to what they've done, and that's extremely grounding. And I don't think it takes away from that feeling of expression and freedom.
I'm thinking about, responsibility and sort of, talking about, sort of reiterating what I was saying earlier. I think we sort of a responsibility to ourselves, but sort of a responsibility to sort of like these systems that we are engaging with. And these systems that we're engaging with, and sort of like where the doors are opening and we're getting opportunities and sort of being used to elevate those systems, like they should be elevating us.
Mm.
And I'm going to circle back to what I just said before, the comment that I made before is like, why aren't those systems supporting us? And sort of, it's like, there needs to be a reciprocal relationship. And I think it is our responsibility to hold that accountability to reciprocity.
So what would it look like if those systems were suppressed? Like, can you give me an example, Sam?
Gosh, I could go.
Like maybe you're talking about the example that you brought up before, which is what would it look like if the Studio Museum in Harlem wasn't struggling to erect their new building?
Exactly.
Okay. So if donations were pouring in,
yeah, and
the building was right.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be on the full, it shouldn't be entirely on the backs of Black and brown people to make sure that happens, because we are elevating all these other spaces. And why are we waiting?
Okay, that makes sense to me.
Right.
I want to bring in Grace and ask her whether this is a time for us to take questions. Yeah, it looks like we have some. Yep, she says yep. So Grace, should I read these questions out? Is that the idea? Yeah, okay. That's an affirmative, okay. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm reading as I'm going here. Okay, that doesn't look like a question. Okay, so the first question is from Jesus Rios Coseto, and please forgive me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. Jesus asks, what advice you could give a new artist as to how to sell their work?
Who wants to start with that?
I'm sorry. I think, depending on where you are in your career, you sort of just figure it out. You're in your studio, you sort of just create a support system around you. And I think like the biggest thing I got out of like a studio practice is not really sales. It's really making the work and not thinking about it in that way, because when you're making the work, you sort of figure out how to, I'm sorry, phone call just came through, weird. But in a way you're thinking about it, thinking about building your practice and building your work, and you find way to make a living in different ways if your work is not selling. Because if you think about sales all the time, then your work might really take a hit in the wrong direction, really.
Bingo.
Good answer.
For sure. So shall we go on to the next question? Yeah,
Yes.
cool. I have a question from Saul Ostro, who says that Walter Benjamin walked against anesthetizing politics, but called for a political aesthetic. How do the panelists understand this difference, and what role do they see that difference is playing in the struggle against racism? So the idea is this anesthetizing politics versus a political aesthetic. Does that make sense to you? I must admit, I'm not familiar with Walter Benjamin's discussion of this at all. So I'd be really merely guessing. If any of you are really familiar with are familiar with Benjamin, that'd be great to jump in here, but no.
I haven't read Benjamin in a while, and I'm not quite clear on what the question is.
Yeah, and I think it would be unfair or probably a bit too speculative for us to just sort of guess. So with y'all's permission, I'm just going to move on to the next question. Okay. Mary Herbachek, would you please describe how the messages against injustice can be specific without referencing recognizable imagery? Good question.
Titles.
You what?
For me, it's material and titles.
Right. Mhm.
Same here with titles as a way I mark my works, and everything else sort of just opens up from there, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. I guess for me, it's really rooted in the material, and the layering of the material, um, and even like how the piece is made. It's clearly layered. There's like the texture, the document. I know that is um, not abstract, but like what materials are in it. And I'm really deliberate about like even in the tag of the work, where it lists the title, the date. I list out every material. So there's a thought about why is it, denim and cotton and indigo and hair dye and all these things. And hopefully there is a point where the viewer starts connecting the relationship between all these materials.
I do want to say too, before I move on to the next question, your use of the term document, Adebunmi, made me actually think of Walter Benjamin. Because there is one thing that Benjamin has said that really stuck with me. And this is from way back in undergrad. He said that there is no document of civilization that is not also a document of barbarism. And I think of that when I think of the indigo, because the ability to actually stain, to dye clothing blue is a kind of mark of technological sophistication, right? Like it's a
Yeah.
kind of mark of a certain echelon, epoch and echelon, I think, in civilization. But it is also always built upon the backs of indentured servitude and slavery and the kind of barbarity that was endemic to these institutions.
Correct. Yeah, like I remember I had a show in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh has a huge history of how they were kind of enslaved on indigo plantations to produce for England. So like just having blue work became a point of connection between how they thought about my history in South Carolina and their history all the way across the world. And you're right, because like when you look at even the history and the development of indigo, it was the better way, it was the advancement of using woad, which made it just more technological, like advanced, like a more vibrant way of producing the color blue. So yeah.
Yep. If Sam or Tariku want to jump in here, let me know. Otherwise, I'll just read the next question.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay. On the matter of institutions using artists to elevate their profiles versus the institution elevating the artists, how do historically white, he puts in parentheses, I should say this question comes from Elliot Reichert. On the matter of institutions using artists to elevate their profiles versus the institution elevating the artists, how do historically white supremacist institutions like museums begin that work without entirely dismantling themselves? Wow, do we have like time to tackle this? Okay. Wow.
It's a complicated question for sure.
That is a complicated question.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody? How do they essentially get at this work of elevating artists as opposed to using artists to elevate themselves without dismantling the institution entirely?
I mean, go ahead.
I think that in some form there has to be sort of, I don't know. It's really interesting how the use of specific terms can sort of like disrupt things, because I'm not even sure that I want to use, the word dismantle, but I think that in some way there has to be some sort of loss, or this may even be a more maybe not be a better word, but like a loss or some sort of death or dying of the old for new growth. And I think that is, a real reality. And I think, I think there has to be, I think one of the, probably the strongest, or the biggest problems is maybe there is a fear that there will be sort of like this complete takeover, if you will. And, fear is like a huge part of getting in the way of anything. But I think there has to be some sort of, loss or death in order for something to grow, something to change, something to happen. And, there has to be some sort of, compromise, like some things have to be compromised and some things like just have got to go.
Yeah.
Is the constant struggle between being at the gate and knocking on the door and saying, let me in, and then but once you're in, or if you are let in, you would change everything up because to serve the type of people that are outside of the gate. That brings me to this organization, Occupy Museums, if you guys remember them. And their way was protesting museums. And they were part of, they were put in a few different museums to do a show with like a bunch of artists they had picked that, normally that would not be shown in these spaces. And in 2017, they did the Whitney Biennial, and they had picked me as one of their 500 artists to display a small piece or something. And so the work they did was really tackling these kinds of questions. They're outside of the gate, knocking on the gate, saying, "Hey, like occupy all these museums." And Occupy Museums, I think the term comes from the 2011 movement, Occupy Wall Street. And so, and we've seen how that have turned out. And so with Occupy Museums, once they were invited, they were able to bring in all these artists, but not to stay too much on that subject there. But it is a complicated question because there's no one way of, tackling it. There's, you can't just, like dismantle the White House today and then say, hey, cool, anarchy or something. So there's always like this, some things that you could address, and then other things takes time, right? And so I think, I don't know, that's best left there for me, at least.
Adebunmi, do you want to say something here?
No, I think there.
You don't have to. You have to. If you don't, there's one last question I want to throw you out to you guys, which I think was kind of a lighter and more personal question. So, if with your permission.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this comes from Johanna Almiron. I actually have worked with Joanna through Hyperallergic. I've edited some of her pieces. She's a really lovely human being and a really smart person. She says, "Thank you for such a candid and thoughtful conversation. I'm always curious about the relationship between the visual, literary, and music. What are you guys listening to right now or reading? And are there writers and museums that show up in your work or in your process? Thank you." I thought this was going to be an easy one. I thought y'all just be saying, "Oh yeah, I was just listening to Kendrick Lamar, and there's this piece, and it has like this." I don't know, like no.
Well, I guess right now I'm reading, which is like you said you went to end light, but the book is called "The Price for Their Pound of Flesh: The Value of Enslaved from the Womb to the Grave and the Building of a Nation."
Wow.
But and that book has really been a lot for me, but just like so informative because I'm currently working on a series where I'm taking true blue, the actual dirt, and making it into a series in ceramic. So thinking about that idea of value and how it connects to how we value like these systems of value within that period of slavery has been coming incredibly informative in this kind of part of my work. But like, what am I listening to? I have like Spotify, like just anything, any Black music, hip hop, reggae, R&B, jazz, like Afro beats, the last poets, like poetry, speeches. I just hit shuffle.
Okay. That's cool.
Yeah,
Thank you.
in the last year, I haven't been reading as much as I'd like to, and I sort of, things kind of went on pause. But I'm sort of referencing what Tariku was talking about in terms of joy, because I feel like I've been sort of reading. I've read some heavy stuff,
Mhm.
and I remember, just like I've been reading the book, Medical Apartheid, if you're familiar with it, and I've mentioned that a lot, and I've been picking it up and putting it down. It's a really hard read, and I don't know, in a lot of ways, I just kind of want to step back and just like read something that's pleasant and sort of maybe isn't so painful.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And I think, probably music in the same way. Like, I'm not listening to anything specific right now, but I think for me in the last, year and a half, like the work that I make and what I reference, it's all just sort of been amplified. It's like, I need a damn break.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah.
Feel you. Yeah.
Um, for me, last season, well, last quarter at least, I was reading How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney. I was actually rereading it, and then I've sort of taken a break from that as well. And I'm a sucker for Greek mythology, so I was reading Homer of the Iliad, and I just started to actually. It's like it's such a great tool to think about mythology in ways that how we've casted stories into society, and it being realistic and sort of sips into the way we think and the way it structures the way we exist together in society. So that sort of just bleeds into a new body of work I'm working on called Mata Samai, which is a way of projecting your ideas into constellations, right? When you're thinking about Orion's belt, or Saturn, Jupiter, or all these names that come from like Greek words or Greek culture, Roman Empire, all that stuff. So I just thought it would be really cool to go back to my college freshman year of reading of like Homer the Iliad, to think about how these stories had really influenced our society that we live in today. And so but also just enjoying it, right?
Yeah, fantastic. And I just want to, before Mary kind of brings us all to a close, I want to suggest to you, Tariku, since you're interested in that you listen to an episode of the Daily Podcast, which is produced by the New York Times.
Okay.
They had a big story just this past Saturday on Dan L. Padilla Peralta, who is a classic scholar, who is originally from the Dominican Republic, who has made a big engineered a sort of big rift in the classics discipline, which is all about Greek and Roman antiquity. He basically makes the argument that classics has to end as a discipline in order for it to for us to be able to dismantle its relationship to white supremacy. So that I think will be fascinating
Great.
for you.
Yeah. If you don't mind sending me that, that'll be amazing.
I can lend you I can send you the link. I'll write it down.
Can you
Thank
send
you.
me the link too?
Okay, I'll send everybody the link. It's cool. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you all. And I'm just going to read you one question or one comment from the audience where they said they love the emphasis on joy. And I think that brings us back to Tariku's show, to joy as resistance. And so, I thank you all for illuminating your work and illuminating the times for us and providing a way for us to interpret the times that we're living in. So on behalf of all our speakers, Seph, Samuel, Adebunmi, Tariku, thank you all. And I want to thank our audience for your attention, for your questions, and for your presence with us, even virtually. We feel you. Thank you for joining the Sixth Conversation Galerie Lelong Dialogues. Today at 5 p.m., Tariku is going to lead an actual in-person, and I will repeat that, in-person walkthrough at the gallery, and also Saturday at 2 p.m. Everyone is welcome to attend, and please follow the gallery on Instagram at Galerie Lelong or visit our website. From all of us, from all my colleagues here at the gallery in New York and in Paris, thank you for being here, and thank you for resisting with joy. Thank you all.
So yeah,
Thank you, everyone.
thank you.
Thank you.
you.